Since the 20th century, there's been an explosion of new theories and perspectives on the racial identity of ancient Egyptians, some rooted in sound evidence, others not so much. In the early days of Egyptology, we had European scholars who claimed that ancient Egyptians should be considered white. Fast forward to today, we have some who claim that ancient Egyptians were black, and that generations of whitewashing has stolen history away from the black community. Lastly, we have the more contemporary view of modern experts that state that ancient Egyptian people were not black, at least not entirely, and most likely a melting pot of people, similar to what you'd find in Egypt today. Some think the black Egyptian theory started with ignorant Americans who believed that since Egypt was in Africa, Africa equals black, therefore Egypt was likely black. But the theories actually have a deeper root: Afrocentricity, sometimes referred to as Afrocentrism. This was a direct response to Eurocentrism, which promoted the idea that modern civilization owed all of its achievements to the great white race and miracle of European enlightenment, first sparked by the ancient Greeks and then came to fruition at the end of the Middle Ages. In the early days of Egyptology, the sentiment was that Black Africa had no share in the creation of any of the first civilizations of man, and that ancient Egyptians should be classified as part of the Indo-European race. This all changed in the 1950s when historian and anthropologist Sheikh Anta Diop made several shocking conclusions, one being that ancient Egyptian language and culture shared more in common with sub-Saharan Africans, as opposed to Middle Eastern people. He went on to gather evidence from melanin levels in mummies. He used written accounts from ancient Greek historians, as well as other data to support his theory that ancient Egyptians should be classified as black. His studies were met with both support and critique. Many Egyptologists still reject his conclusions with the reason that he lacked sufficient evidence to back his claims. In the black community, we started hearing more and more about black ancient Egypt, and that early European archaeologists wanted to erase evidence like destroying the nose of the Sphinx to hide the fact that it had more of an African nose. A similar version of history even made it into a popular Nas song. The logic behind this was that European historians couldn't bear the idea of an advanced civilization such as the ancient Egyptians being black, a notion that would clearly contradict the concept of European superiority over black Africans. So at this point, many in the black community started believing that ancient Egyptian history was black history, and therefore our history. How could black people be inferior if we built all of this, thousands of years before the golden age of Greek civilization? It of course sparked a greater sense of pride in the black community. No longer was our history being dominated by images of subjugation and cruelty from Europeans. We're now able to claim ancient Egyptians as our people. If we also take into account the Pan-African influence, the idea that all black people share a strong bond regardless of location, the idea that all black people are one race and we all share the same destiny. But there's one glaring problem with the black ancient Egyptian argument. Why aren't modern Egyptians black? Well, there's a theory that some won't like. The theory is that since Egypt was invaded by the Arabs in the Middle Ages, this pushed most of the black Egyptians further south into Sudan, and generations of mixing and migration broadened the ethnicity of Egyptians into what we can see today. European curators have said to use a similar narrative to deny today's Egyptians the right to reclaim stolen artifacts from European museums. If there's an argument that the current occupants of Egypt aren't the true descendants of ancient Egypt, then why should they hold a claim to those precious relics? Modern Egyptians have been battling this invasion idea by trying to cement themselves as the true descendants of ancient Egyptians. Some have even used the term pharaoh to describe political leaders. We've also seen comparisons being drawn with ancient pharaohs and current national heroes. This helps to promote continuity between modern Egyptians and their ancient counterparts. In recent times, the debate of Cleopatra comes into play. Of any of the pharaohs that ever lived, this is probably the one with the least evidence of being black. She was the pharaoh during the Ptolemaic period of Egypt. The Ptolemaic kingdom was an ancient Greek state founded by this guy, Ptolemy I Stoter. He was a Greek general during Alexander the Great's campaign throughout the Middle East. Egyptians would describe this dynasty as Greek conquerors and were not seen as native Egyptian. Cleopatra was actually the first in her family to bother learning Egyptian. She lived nearly 300 years after Ptolemy I, but this Greek dynasty would intermarry with other Greek and Persian families, and would even intermarry within the family to keep their bloodline pure. The Greeks and Romans had many depictions of Cleopatra where she looks like your typical Greek woman. Of course, these could all be lies, but I've yet to see evidence of that. I just don't see why the Romans would want to whitewash Cleopatra. If anything, the Romans despised her, and would even use propaganda to try and tarnish her reputation. So, were ancient Egyptians black? The suitable follow-up could be which ones? Ancient Egyptian history is vast. We're talking over 3,000 years. I would think it's entirely possible that the genetic makeup of Egyptians could have shifted with time. So many migrations and invasions. During the Kushite rule over Egypt, there were certainly pharaohs who were black. If we look at some of the depictions of ancient Egyptians, you could certainly draw comparisons with people from Sudan or Ethiopia, and these people are certainly classified as black. We also have to keep in mind one very important thing: the social construct of race. The category for black changes depending on who you ask. A person who is considered black in the US could be considered white in Brazil. When discussing her mixed heritage, Mariah Carey once stated that she was black. In 1887, at the pyramids in Egypt, African-American reformist Frederick Douglass encountered a white American family who mistook him for an Arab man and mistakenly thought he couldn't speak English. In 1930, the US started classifying black people using the one-drop rule. No longer were you mixed if one of your parents was black and the other white. You were legally considered black. This is of course an outdated belief, but no doubt still lingers in the US. Now let's get to the DNA evidence. The conclusion from multiple DNA studies is that modern Egyptians have a close resemblance to their ancient counterparts. In essence, the DNA points to ancient Egyptians having more in common with Middle Eastern people from Lebanon than they would from Sudan. Personally, I find it hard to believe that there's a conspiracy between multiple institutions to distort DNA evidence on such a large scale. The evidence points towards a multi-ethnic society which, due to their location and history, makes a lot of sense. As for cultural affinity with Sudanese and Ethiopians, I can certainly believe that a society with a lighter complexion had a strong cultural connection with their neighbors to the south, especially with the Nile River playing such a key role in trade. But let's ask the question, even if they had more in relation to people from Sudan and Ethiopia, what does that have to do with the African diaspora? Why should we claim Egyptian history? Our ancestry came from here, not here. There are plenty of impressive kingdoms that existed in this part of Africa that Black Americans should be proud of. We shouldn't need to try and claim something that has played little to no part in our own history. I've also seen this narrative pushed for the simple fact that because their paintings look like us, therefore they are us. What I find most sad is that some members of the Afro diaspora seem to want to cling on to ancient Egyptian culture to build connection with the ancient past and their own heritage, but in doing so, pushing aside kingdoms and empires that are far more relevant in our own history, disregarding their own history in favor of a more glamorous and famous one. The question of ancient Egyptians being black or white, I think is a question too simple to answer. I've looked at the evidence on both sides, and I would say from what I've seen of the artwork and sculptures of themselves, I would imagine a multi-ethnic society that had more darker people than lighter. They also certainly saw themselves darker than their Libyan neighbors to the west, but also lighter than their Nubian neighbors to the south. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.